Hi, everybody. Now, many of you may be wondering why are we talking about India and China? It's not in the headlines. It feels like a period of relative calm. Well, I have a couple of reasons why this story should definitely be in the headlines. It is definitely newsworthy. Number one, the winter setting in. Indian and Chinese soldiers are going to remain deployed against each other in these winter months. Number two, we've seen images, some very disturbing images of Indian soldiers in so called Chinese captivity. And we haven't had answers, responses, acknowledgement, or any kind of explanation. We've also seen very, very sharp statements from both sides, India and China. We've seen a build-up of heavy infrastructure on both sides. We've also had what could be called two ingressions, PLA soldiers coming into Barahoti in Uttarakhand and another one in Arunachal Pradesh. And yet, in spite of all of this, one hasn't really seen a robust assessment of where things stand. Remember, there have been almost 13 rounds of talks with really no movement forward. So I'm going to try and attempt to understand where this story stands. Why is it a story that seems like one of the most underreported stories of our times, or at least of this year, in the face of so much happening? I'm going to try and attempt to do that with Ajai Shukla. He's a retired army officer, someone who knows the area well, someone who's written extensively about the Chinese moves much of last year. Ajay, I really appreciate you sparing this time and talking to us.
Pleasure to be with you, Anubha.
Ajay, I want to start with those images that were released by the Chinese side. Everyone's termed them as propaganda video, and possibly they are that. I am not going to play them beyond a point that I need to ask this question because I'm sure they're extremely disturbing, even to a soldier like yourself. But what do these images show us? Do we now, more than 1 year later, have really a full sense of what happened in Galwan last year in June? How many soldiers were in captivity? How did they come back? How did that exchange happen?
Yes, these images hugely disturbing. I agree with you. To see Indian soldiers in such sort of obviously in need of medical help, being pushed and shoved by Chinese sort of soldiers, it's not something that any soldier can see and remain unaffected by. The images date back to June last year, when there was that ugly fracas on the border, when 20 Indian soldiers and an unspecified number, we still don't know the number really of Chinese soldiers who were killed when that happened. And what was a sort of a lesser sort of known part of that particular incident was that in addition to 20 soldiers being killed, about 10 Indian soldiers were also captured. And the images that you see in that video are of the soldiers who were captured. I'm happy to say that they were returned in sort of relatively okay condition. They have gotten okay, they've recovered, and they are back in on duty. But as you can see from those images, it was a really ugly fracas, and the government should really have done more to inform the country about it, but they were in a complete denial mode at that time. You can say that they still remain in that denial mode, though some things are now emerging as a result of the talks between the military commanders.
Hmm. We'll talk about the talks because there've been almost 13 rounds of talks, and one would say with really no movement, some very sharp words coming in from both sides. It seemed both sides feel are accusing each other of being obstinate and stubborn. Do you want to add in a line on the timing of why China decided to release this video at this particular time, almost a year and a half later? Because it came very, very close to that 13th round of military level talks, sort of almost coming up with no conclusion.
Well, Anubha, I can only speculate, and it would seem to me that the Chinese are also sort of juggling a very right wing domestic audience. We tend to believe that the Chinese can get away with anything, the Chinese government. That's not the case. They are under pressure from their own right wing constituents. There are blogs and so on that are read and very widely in China. And those are very right wing, aggressive bloggers who are writing there. They're putting pressure on the Chinese government to sort of show the Indians their place, as it were, and perhaps as a consequence of that, and to answer and to show their own audience that they were sort of also, doing, I should say, gain an upper hand. The Chinese were. They may have released these videos in order to build that impression.
Post those talks, there have been statements from both sides. China's not come to the table with anything constructive. The Chinese side saying India's sort of being obstinate. From where things stand, and I don't know if it's a fair question, which side seems more obstinate and uninterested in ending what is now a prolonged deployment?
Well, obviously, the Chinese, because they have the upper hand. They have put their troops into places where they want them to be. In places like the Depsang subsector, the Chinese are holding the positions that they would like to hold. So, it's the advantageous position that always tends to favor the status quo. India had taken charge of or taken control of some very good positions on the south bank of the Pangongso Lake. But as a part of the sort of disengagement in that sector, we surrendered those positions. So where we would have been wanting the status quo to be held, is sort of surrendered in a way. We've lost the advantage there. So I think the Chinese are the ones who are, to whatever extent, there's no clear winner or loser over here. But it would seem that the Chinese are the ones who are happier with how things have gone.
From all the statements so far, and considering the fact that we are entering winter, both sides have a heavy build-up. The army chief sort of also indicating LAC, the new LOC. Is this now? Is there now every indication that this is for the long haul?
Well, it certainly is for the long haul. I mean, the Chinese have sort of conceded what they want to concede. They're not going to concede much more. It has to be said. We express concern that our troops would have to spend winter out in those extremely difficult conditions. But the fact is that the Chinese are also in the same position. They have to spend winter out also. So, to that extent, I don't believe that the Chinese are sort of not paying a cost. They are paying a cost as well. But having talked their way and acted their way into this position of confrontation, the Chinese cannot withdraw from this sort of position either. So both sides are sort of wondering, I would imagine, how to get out of it without losing face. To some extent, they have done it in a couple of sectors, but there are other sectors which still remain to be done. And winter, as you said, is upon us. It is unlikely whether that they would be able to do it before winter sets in for this year.
You mentioned about parts, some of the sectors where the conflict, in a sense, still remains unresolved, and some parts where we did disengage. Now, that announcement came in February of 2021, if I'm correct, to an agreement to disengage, so to speak. Since then, a whole lot of military experts, as well as within the army, there seems to be an indication that things really haven't moved on the ground or the implementation has been slow. 1.5 years later, where does the conflict, very, very briefly, stand unresolved still? Uh, yeah.
Well, in some areas, there is a disengagement that has taken place. Galwan was the first to have an disengagement. Uh, Now, one can sort of argue about the pros and cons of the disengagement itself. One could argue, as I have done in my writing for Business Standard, that the Chinese have been given an advantageous settlement. They are now in positions where they were not earlier. And to that extent, we have lost a certain advantage in that disengagement. But always remember that even if you have lost a certain advantage, you have gained from the fact that you have disengaged. And the Indian troops, just like the Chinese troops, would not like to be in a position where they are spending winter after winter in those freezing heights. So to that extent, I would say in Galwan, in Pangong Tso, in the north, the South Bank as well. While we can say that India has got a disadvantageous, a bum deal, as it were, it is to some consolation that India is at least disengaged and the troops are not at those difficult positions. Now, taking it further, there are other sectors like Depsang where neither has disengagement taken place, nor are the troops sort of free from the burden of having to spend winter at those heights. Now, that is what sort of would raise questions in any analyst's mind. Why have we settled in some sectors, and that to the sectors where we hold the advantage, and not settled in the other sectors where China holds the advantage? It should be a quid pro quo. There should be give and take, one sector for another. That has not taken place. So
Can I
Depsang
push you
is a
further as to
clear example.
Can I push you further as to why you believe that hasn't taken place?
Because the Chinese came in with clear objectives. They wanted to gain advantages in certain areas, and Depsang, which is the northernmost tip of the Indian subcontinent, the Karakoram Pass is the precise point, which is the northernmost tip. They believed that they wanted India to be under some pressure over there. India had built an airfield. India had sort of landed sort of transport aircraft over there. India had built up a larger troop presence there. And the Chinese, also it's believed, felt that the Daulat Beg Oldi sector, which is where Depsang is, provided the Indian troops that have built up in that sector an avenue to move eastwards and threaten their sort of very strategic highway that they have over there that connects Tibet with Xinjiang. It's called various things, the Western Highway, it's called G219. But the fact is that China is very sensitive about that highway. It absolutely does not want India to have any sort of advantageous position when it comes to threatening that highway. And to that extent, they have occupied Indian positions. They have come 15 kilometers deep into Indian territory, and they are sort of sticking to their guns, and they are showing no inclination of moving out from there.
I want to bring in the point that you mentioned about the quid pro quo and even the areas where we have disengaged. There is a lot of commentary around buffer zones, especially the finger area of Pangong Tso, Galwan Valley, where we've created these three buffer zones between 8 to 10 kilometers, if I'm right, where neither side can patrol. And there are many military experts and good minds who are saying that we shouldn't have done that because this is China. In a sense, we've given up what were our claims through these buffer zones. I think recently in the October talks, there was a Chinese demand of a fourth buffer zone, which India said no, buffer zones can be a start of the peace process, but not really something that have to stick throughout. What would your assessment be, and how does one understand what these buffer zones are?
A buffer zone, Anubha, as its sort of name would suggest, is simply an area of a territory which is treated as a no-go zone. neither the Chinese nor the Indians are allowed to enter a buffer zone. And it is hoped that, earlier they had worked out various modalities and operating principles where Indian and Chinese patrols could patrol up to their claim lines. The Chinese had one set of claim lines, the Indians had another set. They were different and divergent, but both sides were allowed to exert their claim by patrolling up to the claim line. Now, this changes when you create a buffer zone. Neither the Chinese nor the Indians can enter that buffer zone, so they are no longer able to patrol up to their claim lines. The reason for doing such a step is clearly that the principle of operating up to your claim lines and still managing to keep the peace, still managing to avoid confrontation and fighting has clearly not worked. It has been now felt that if you continue with this business of patrolling up to your claim lines, conflict is inevitable, clashes will take place. So instead of that, they've created these buffer zones. So the Chinese come up to a point, the Indians come up to a point, and there is a clear gap between those 2 points, which cannot be crossed, and therefore conflict is avoided.
But I'm wondering how that holds true and why this threat of conflict, or at least a risk of conflict, doesn't hold, let's say, when there is an ingression, if I can call it, in a place like Barahoti in Uttarakhand. Isn't it true that Barahoti, in a sense, has also been broadly demilitarized and no sort of troops enter there? But we had reports of PLA soldiers coming in there, destroying a bridge, etc.
Yes, and this is one of the evidences or the reasons why we need to be so concerned about the current crisis and the way it is playing out. Because earlier, this Barahoti area, the central sector of the India-China border, was relatively peaceful, relatively calm. The two sides had agreed to exchange maps over here. There were no sort of clashes that took place in these areas. Now, sort of the old sort of peace or the modus vivendi of keeping the peace clearly seems to have been abandoned by both sides. They are back to clashing over there at Barahoti, and we can't be sanguine about it, because remember, Barahoti was one of the sectors where a clash led to the 1962 war. So we have to be extremely careful. We have to treat this sort of development and this sort of the militarization and the fighting that is now taking place in these central sectors as something that needs to be addressed and taken care of.
Um, over the last couple of days, a whole lot of defense reporters really have been in Tawang, and there's been a lot of imagery coming in of the Indian deployment, military systems, weapon systems, etc. Um, how do we add up when compared to what's on the Chinese side?
Oh, well, the fact is that the Chinese are ahead of us in building up. They have managed to sort of replace the older weapons and the sort of less effective weapons that they had with more effective weapons. They have moved in systems like the S-400 air defense missile system, which is now known to be deployed in the Demchok area, and which will erode our advantage that we have in the Air Force sort of dimension. Uh, and now clearly the Indian government feels that they need to send out a message that we're also doing something. So they are doing the standard thing that they always do, which is to load a bunch of defense correspondents into a aircraft, fly them to the trouble spot, and then brief them over there about what they are doing. It's not as if the Indians are doing nothing. It's just that they feel that they really need to sort of put out the story that the Indian side is as well prepared as the Chinese. How true that is, I don't know. I'm not one of the journalists who was invited.
Yeah, and we possibly can sort of fathom the reasons behind that, Ajay. As I wrap up this conversation, uh, what is this? What is this confrontation? What is the fact that India and China, are two sides of the line of actual control, building up troop infrastructure, mean for the entire region? Considering there've been extremely sharp words for the Chinese, whether it's coming in from Taiwan or from other countries as well.
Oh, well, let's remember one thing. You started off this conversation with a very perceptive sort of observation that this is probably one of the biggest stories in the world, and we are not giving it enough due. It is the biggest story in the world if you look at reporting outside India. The United States government and its relationship with China, the appointment of Nick Burns as the ambassador, he's making statements like calling what is happening in Xinjiang a genocide. Uh, the world is greatly concerned. For the first time in decades, the United Kingdom has moved an aircraft carrier battle group from the UK into the South China Sea. So everybody seems to be concerned, except the one country that is actually in physical contact and in combat with China, and that is India. This is a dichotomy, to say the least. I think we need to be covering the story in far greater detail. The world is already doing so. China needs to feel some pressure from different directions. And if you sort of give China the impression, as we have done for decades, that we are sort of afraid to actually point the finger at China and to sort of accuse it of sort of non-peaceful activities and of violating the sort of long-held peace on the border, then China will only be emboldened and encouraged to take that further. So I think that the point you made is a very valid one, and we need to sort of do what the international community is doing, which is to point the finger quite clearly and audibly at China.
Just as sort of a final sign off, Ajay, you've sort of talked about the past 3 decades, right? And over the past 3 decades, whenever conversations between of India and China have happened, we've talked about exchanging maps. This is a boundary dispute. This is going to take long till we demarcate the LAC, etc. And now, within a span of nearly 1.5 years, we've come to this position where this is a point of crisis. What do you believe India is prepared for? I mean, it's sort of a crystal ball gaze kind of a question, but what are the eventualities that India is preparing for?
Well, the eventualities that India is preparing for are, first of all, the build up on the Chinese side, the sort of troops, the new weapon systems, the Air Force aircraft, all of this needs to be taken extremely seriously and needs to be answered with a counter build up. India has done that to a great extent, but it is still not as well prepared as China is, for the simple reason that China, over the decades, has taken the lead in infrastructure building. So that is another area that India needs to focus on building infrastructure, and at the same time, talks have to continue. A dialogue process has to be maintained. India has to leverage the pressure that is being put by the international community on China. The we are not alone in this thing, but we just behave like we're alone. So I would say that India is not without weapons. India needs to get a sense of its own strength, get a sense of its own bargaining chips, and put the pressure on China so that we are not sort of getting the impression that we are completely alone against this emerging superpower.
Fair enough, Ajay. I'll leave it here, but thank you so much for your time.